In a faraway time, deep in the northern kingdom of Israel, the story of Jonah takes shape as a patchwork of symbols. The Hebrew name for Jonah, which sounds like the word for dove, makes you think of peace and purity. On the other hand, this man's life is about to get rough, which will test his faith and spirit. At first, Jonah is a complicated person. He is meant to be a peace agent, but his path keeps putting divine standards and his own beliefs to the test. The call from heaven to Jonah, which is wrapped in very spiritual language, is not just a mission, it is a wake-up call to act. His mother, Amittai, whose name means true, is very reliable, but Jonah doesn't want to be like her. Why is Jonah, a man who is supposed to bring peace, forced to go into Nineveh, a city known for its violence and corruption? The lesson that God taught Jonah is very deep. When we are going through the worst, our true faith is tested and our real reason can be seen. God picks Jonah to talk to Nineveh not because he is bad, but because he can make people change and think. How can our own spiritual and moral problems today be seen in Jonah's story? The story of Jonah's journey can help us understand ourselves and grow spiritually. Every problem and hurdle Jonah faces is a metaphor for the moral issues and tough choices we all have to make in our lives. The story then goes on to show how Jonah didn't want to do what God told him to do and instead chose to ignore his duties. Because he disobeyed, he ended up in the belly of a big fish, which was an experience that goes beyond common sense and made him think deeply about himself and his spiritual life. That night, Jonah has to face his own innermost thoughts in complete solitude. This leads to a profound realization about God's kindness and love, which includes those living in Nineveh. People still think about Jonah's story, from running away to facing God, from hopelessness to being saved. It makes us think about how we respond to God's calls in our lives and how we deal with problems. At the end of this story, there is a clear message of hope and rebirth. It reminds us that both God and people have the power to change and forgive. As we continue to look at Jonah's story and the deep lessons it can teach us, I want you to think about the parts of your life where you might be ignoring the call to show kindness. Tell us in the comments how you think you can improve in that area. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel if you like this story. That way you won't miss our next videos. Also, if you want to help this job, please leave a super thanks. We can keep telling more Bible stories and spreading this message of faith and hope thanks to your donation. Thank you for your help. Going on, before he starts his huge job of teaching in Nineveh, Jonah makes a choice that shapes who he is and where he is going. He ends up running away. He picked Tarshish as his goal because it represents both a faraway safe place in space and a break from his spiritual duties. The irony in what he did is that it has more than one meaning. As he rises, he doesn't move closer to the goal. Instead, he moves back, looking for the other end of his calling. The Hebrew phrase, milifnei Adonai, which means to run away from the Lord, shows how much he was against God. It's not just a simple turn down or a painful beating. It's an attempt to separate himself from being a messenger and from his connection with God. This spiritual flight is acted out through a number of physical and figurative descents that Jonah makes. With each one, he gets further away from his purpose and essence. When Jonah gets to Joppa, a busy port full of tourists and traders, he finds a ship that will take him to the place he wants to go. He pays the price, which shows that he is committed to the road he has chosen. No matter how small this action may seem, it has a lot of weight. It's the price he paid for trying to be independent and straying from the path God had chosen for him. When Jonah gets on the ship, his trip gets even more dramatic. As the ship sets sail, a fierce storm happens, which is a physical representation of how he feels inside. The sailors are afraid for their lives, so they question Jonah's appearance. This makes them think about what they did and what will happen as a result. The storm is not only a physical barrier, it is also a mental barrier that makes him face the fact that he has to flee. Then Jonah faces the truth. He has to face the truth about himself and his flight as the storm gets worse. He tells the sailors the truth about who he is and who his God is. He also tells them that his flight is making them all very upset. This admission is a turning point in his journey because it's the first thing that makes him realize his role and his fate. As a sign of both despair and insight, Jonah offers to be thrown into the sea. This act of sacrifice shows how he is torn between running away and accepting his calling. The water is a metaphor for both the end and the beginning of something new. It is in the depths that Jonah finally faces his fate and starts to understand what it means to obey and be kind. The story of Jonah is a strong way to think about the moral problems we face today. We all choose different paths, and sometimes, like Jonah, we have to go through storms and deep water to find our real path and mission. Let's think about how we answer the calls we get, whether we run away or take on the tasks we are given, and how each choice affects our life path. The big storm that's happening now on the sea isn't just a natural event. It's also a sign of God's power and a famous reaction to Jonah's mistake. In the book of Genesis, the word ruach is used to talk about the Spirit of God. It is also used to talk about powerful winds. This similarity is a beautiful reflection that God can use natural forces to fix patterns that have been messed up by people. At the height of the chaos, when the sea is drunk, the pagan sailors call out to their own gods. Fear and respect fill the air, which is very different from Jonah's calm state as he sleeps in the ship's hold. The word they use to talk about their fear and respect, ru, shows how the sailors felt two different feelings at the same time. They are scared of the storm, but they respect its strange power. What the captain says to wake Jonah up when he finds him asleep makes the irony even stronger. Why are you acting so sleepy? Get up and pray to your God. In times of trouble, they are not only a cry for help, but also a reminder of God's call, which Jonah tried to avoid. In this case, the repeating word arise is a call to spiritual awakening, which is the opposite of what Jonah did when he tried to hide from his call. It was only after Jonah made a dramatic statement about who he was and his faith that the storm was found to be caused by him. I'm a Hebrew and I fear the Lord. He is the God of heaven who made the land and the sea. Here, the strain between how much he says he fears God and how much he acts in ways that don't match that fear reaches its peak. He tries to listen, though, because he can't fully hide who he is or run away from his background and responsibilities. What the sailors think about this statement is not clear. They have to make a very important choice between fear and interest. What they do next is very important, both for their own safety in the rough sea and for the story that is still developing. And so they decide to throw Jonah into the sea, which is both an abandonment and a step toward the prophet's salvation. Being thrown into the sea represents being clean and starting over. When a big fish swallows Jonah, he is not only saved from death, but he also goes on a trip of self-reflection and change. In the belly of the fish, where it is dark and there are no other people around, Jonah has to face himself and his decisions. This sets the stage for a return that is not only physical, but also spiritual and moral. The story of Jonah shows very well the idea of running away and coming back, of making the right choice and then turning away, and of refusing to listen to God's call. It speaks to everyone's battle with fate, free will, and redemption, and it serves as a warning that there is always a chance to be forgiven and get back on the right path, even when we fail or run away. The sailors have to make a very important choice after Jonah's confession. They now know how powerful the God they were trying to get away from is. He wanted to know how the tone of their knowledge that they are part of a web bigger than natural forces shows up in their questions. It is the divine who rules over them. In an attempt to change his fate and accept it, Jonah offers that he give up his own life to calm the sea. You will make it through this big storm because of me. He says this in a way that makes it sound like his life could save the sailors. Jonah didn't feel sorry for Nineveh at first, but the sailors are desperately rowing against the rough waves to save the prophet. It doesn't matter what they do, though. They reluctantly and regrettably decide to do what Jonah asks, because it is the only way to stop the storm. The sailors call him Bithlu, which sounds like making a sacrifice to God, and throw him overboard. When Jonah disobeys, he unintentionally becomes an offering to make peace between God and people. The part of the story where Jonah is eaten by the big fish is religious and symbolic. The Lord got a big fish ready to eat Jonah. This holy name shows that what seems like a harsh punishment is actually an act of kindness, giving Jonah a chance to think about his mistakes and make amends in the fish's belly. Jonah spends 3 days and nights in the belly of the fish, going through what is kind of like a death and then a resurrection. This time period is similar to old practices of spiritual renewal. This chapter is so important that Jesus later talks about it as a preview of his own death and resurrection, making a clear link between the prophet Jonah and the Messiah. While he is stuck in the deep, dark place, Jonah prays very hard to God. During this time of self-reflection, he has a deep spiritual experience. He addresses souls by combining his words with holy texts to show that he is sorry for his actions and hopes that God will forgive him. This prayer is more than just a request for rescue. It's also an acceptance of his part in God's plan, an admission of his failure, and a strong belief in God's ability to save. Today's part of Jonah's trip is a powerful lesson that even in the worst times, there is always a chance to change and be saved. His story shows that God can use even the worst situations for good, teaching lessons that have stood the test of time and continue to shine a light on the path of faith. When Jonah is in the dark, he goes to the only light he knows, the Word of God, which is called Meona Karati, the Lord. Jonah cries out to the Lord from inside the fish. The word Sheol, which he uses to describe his position, makes you think of the afterlife, a place where there is no one and nothing. The figure of speech is strong because it shows that Jonah feels like he has been thrown to the furthest corner of what it means to be human or spiritual. Both physically and figuratively, he is at the bottom. It is a place of death where the only way out is up, toward forgiveness and life. In his prayer, he talks about both hope and sadness. I was thrown into the deep of the ocean, and the current wrapped around me. He says that his situation is like being surrounded by waves and currents, which is a metaphor for being completely surrounded by bad things. Still, he finds a thread of hope in the middle of his pain. I will still see your holy home again. It's not just a wish to stay alive, it's also a promise to return to the holy road and start over spiritually. An immediate and powerful act of God's presence marks the time when Jonah is saved. Why? And the Lord told the fish to throw him away. The details are shocking and come out of nowhere. It is not a gentle dropping on the beach. It is a violent act of birthing again. Jonah is thrown into a new world. He comes up from the depths, not only physically but also mentally refreshed and ready to answer the call he turned down before. When the Lord's word comes to Jonah a second time, he responds right away and without any thought. He talks to Nineveh, and even though his message is very short, only 5 words in the original Hebrew, the reaction is amazing. The fact that Jonah's message doesn't make it clear that people should turn away from their sins shows how reluctantly he obeys, doing only the bare minimum and maybe even showing a hint of resistance. But his words have a deep and far-reaching effect, and they cause a huge change in the city of Nineveh. Everyone in Nineveh reacts with real regret, from the king to the people of Api. They changed the whole city through their faith in God, which is shown in the text. Not only is the size of this change important, but so is the speed with which it is happening. It shows that everyone is ready to convert and change. The story of Jonah, who disobeyed God and then became a spokesperson for a huge miracle, shows how both divine will and human endurance can change things. Jonah's story isn't just about noise and coming back, it's also about how second chances can lead to great things when we fully commit to our goals. A few words change the story of Nineveh in a big way. This is a warning that change can have big effects, even if it's caused by a lack of faith or unwilling obedience. The story of Jonah makes us think about how we can be strong and change. When we're feeling hopeless, holy words can be the thing that keeps us going and points us back to the right road, reminding us that hope and rebirth are close at hand, even in the darkest places. The fact that the king of Nineveh told everyone, even animals, to fast and wear sackcloth shows how seriously and sincerely the people of the city were sorry. Penance isn't just an act that shows you care. It's an act that tries to reach God's heart. This reaction from the whole city, from the most powerful leader to the poorest people and even the animals, shows a rare and strong unity and complete conversion. God is merciful and doesn't bring the disaster he had promised when he sees Nineveh's actions, like how they changed their behavior and gave up being bad. The Hebrew word repent, which was created to describe God's answer, suggests that he can change how he carries out his plans depending on how people respond. This connection between what people do and what God does reinforces a basic truth about the relationship between God and people. When people turn away from their sins, God shows grace and changes his plans. However, Jonah is very unhappy with God's kindness, which many people praise. The word bayera is used in the text to describe his mood, which shows sadness along with a deep pain that is almost physical. Jonah is upset, not because he thinks God is being unfair, but because God's kindness doesn't seem to match the standards of spiritual justice he thought would be applied. In his prayer, Jonah's vision shows why he didn't want to go to Nineveh at first. For this reason, I ran away to Tarshish. I knew you were a kind and forgiving God who would forgive me, that you turn away from evil. Because God is always kind and ready to forgive, this is exactly what Jonah was afraid of. He wanted justice in the form of penalties, not forgiveness as a way to make things right. The struggle inside of Jonah makes us think about how open we are to God's kindness. How often do we push back against the idea of kindness and others, wanting instead to judge and punish? The story of Jonah goes against these tendencies and reminds us that God is more than our narrow ideas of what is fair and kind. God wants to teach Jonah one last lesson in kindness, so he grows the kikalan plant to give the prophet shade and comfort. But then, to show how short-lived human mercy is compared to God's endless mercy, the plant is destroyed. This last act is a strong reminder of how much God cares for us and how powerful he is. God always gives and takes away for the purpose of teaching and revelation. The story of Jonah, which ends with the plant growing and dying, is not just about one man giving up his life and becoming a better person. It's also about how justice and divine kindness, human and divine righteous anger and tender forgiveness interact with each other. This story has been told for a very long time and has a lot to say about how complicated people's hearts are and how much God understands about them. It breaks Jonah's heart that the gourd plant, which gave him shade and a moment of peace on his rough spiritual journey, has died. God uses this sad time to teach a very important lesson. He shows how ironic it is that Jonah felt sorry for the plant, which is temporary and not important, but not for Nineveh, which has over 120,000 people. Do you feel sorry for the plant that you haven't cared for or helped grow? Jonah, God tells him. More than 120,000 people in the great city of Nineveh can't tell the difference between their right and left hands. I don't feel sorry for them. God's interpellation is not just a rebuke, it's also a deep thought on how God's mercy goes beyond what humans can understand. The fact that he talked about many horses in his speech shows that God cares about everything, not just people. At the end of the book of Jonah, God asks this rhetorical question that makes the reader think about how merciful God is and how we treat people we think are not deserving of forgiveness. This ending is meant to be open-ended, so that each person can find themselves in Jonah's deeds and feelings. We are asked to think about ourselves. Are we like Jonah, unwilling to accept God's kindness for others, especially those we see as enemies or adversaries? Also, the story of Jonah sets the stage for ideas that are studied in more depth in the New Testament. Jesus uses Jonah to show that he will die and rise again, making the connection between Jonah's time in the belly of the fish and his own death and rising. The great command of the gospel, in which the word of salvation and forgiveness was sent to all countries, not just the Jewish people, was like Jonah's trip to Nineveh. The way Jonah fought with God's kindness for himself is similar to the arguments the early church had about including Gentiles. Like the early Christians, Jonah has trouble believing that God's grace can reach people of different races and cultures. For many, Jonah's trip is a metaphor for their own spiritual journey. A circle of running away, facing threats, going on a mission, and finally being told to match our hearts with God's. His story is more than just a story. This story makes us think about how we might be resisting God's unimaginable kindness. It also reminds us that our understanding is often limited, but God's love knows no bounds and includes everyone forever. When we think about the story of Jonah, it makes us think about how much faith we have, how much kindness we have, and how willing we are to accept that God, in his infinite knowledge, may choose to act in a way that goes against what we think is fair and right. The story of Jonah shows that he is like Christ in some ways, but not perfectly. The fact that both were sent to their deaths, Jonah to the sea and Jesus to the cross, to calm storms of a different kind, one physical and the other spiritual, makes this comparison even clearer. While Jonah reluctantly gave up his life because he didn't want to follow God's call, Jesus willingly took his fate with a deep sense of loyalty. Jesus Christ's sacrifice was an act of unwavering love that would not only save people from the coming punishment, but also restore the permanent relationship between God and people. This comparison makes us think about what suffering really means and how much it really costs to be saved. Because Jonah disobeyed God, he was thrown into the sea to save the ships from a storm. Similarly, Jesus died as a sacrifice to save people from their sins, which is a divine plan that goes beyond time and space. Jonah's trip to Nineveh is more than just making a prophecy. His story is a strong warning that Bible prophecy is mostly a call to turn away from sin. It's not just a guess about what might happen. It's also a call to change that can make things different. Nineveh was saved not because a prophet made a mistake, but because its answer to Jonah's call showed that people could be forgiven and change their minds. Important parts of the Bible view of how God works with his creation. Also, Jonah's initial resistance and later submission show how the will of God and human will are always at odds with each other. This relationship is important to our spiritual growth because it shows the struggles we face when we try to balance our own wants with God's bigger plans for our lives. The story of Jonah makes us question what we think we know about justice and kindness. It also encourages us to see God's love as more inclusive, including those we think are undeserving. At the end of the book, there is a strong question from God about kindness. God tells Jonah that he needs to take care of the many animals and more than 120,000 people in Nineveh who can't tell the difference between their right and left hands. To sum up, this result not only shows how great God's mercy is, but it also shows us how little we understand and show this care every day. As the end of the story of Jonah suggests, may we learn to see that everyone and everything deserves God's love and kindness. We should be asked to think about where in our lives we don't answer God's call to charity and how we can more fully accept God's love for everyone. It's important to think about ourselves and take on new challenges. This thought ends Jonah's story and encourages us to keep on his journey. The story of Jonah should move and inspire us all to have a better knowledge of and stronger commitment to God's love and mercy. This will help us have a faith that is shown not only in words, but also in actions of grace and forgiveness. Please let this lesson ring true in our lives as a call to live in a way that is closer to God's heart. We hope that the story of Jonah has made you think about how you can show pity and kindness to others. If this movie spoke to you, please share it with your family and friends to help spread the word of hope and change. Don't forget to subscribe to our station so you can see more stories that lift our spirits, teach us important lessons, and improve our faith. One heart at a time, we can change the world. Thank you for following us to the end of this incredible story. See you in the next video. May God be with you always. Amen.